It was the kind of wedding people talk about for years. Picture perfect, filled with smiles and laughter. Tommy Sanders, the town's golden boy, was finally tying the knot with the stunning and ambitious Janine Parker. On the surface, it was a celebration of love and happiness. But behind the vows and the cheers, dark secrets simmered, waiting to erupt and turn this fairy tale into a nightmare no one saw coming. Tommy wasn't just any guy. He was the pride of Pinefield, Georgia, known for his honesty, hard work, and a smile that could light up a room. He'd built a name for himself running a construction business that seemed to grow with every project. People looked at Tommy and saw the kind of man every father would want his daughter to marry. And Janine? She was the town's latest sensation. With her sharp wit and striking beauty, she had a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room when she spoke to you. She had everyone wrapped around her finger, except for a few sharp-eyed locals who muttered that she was just a little too perfect. But no one could have guessed how deep her ambition truly ran. The wedding was like a scene from a movie. Janine looked like she'd been plucked from the pages of a bridal magazine, every detail of her gown chosen to dazzle. Tommy, standing tall and proud, couldn't take his eyes off her. The guests laughed and cheered as the couple said their vows under a canopy of twinkling lights. But not all eyes were on the happy couple. Luke Sanders, Tommy's younger brother, stood off to the side, watching it all unfold with a tight smile. His posture was stiff, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, as if trying to hold something back. If anyone had paid closer attention, they might have seen the way his eyes lingered on Janine just a second too long. This story didn't start with chandeliers and champagne. It began in Savannah, where Janine grew up in a cramped, peeling duplex on the edge of town. Life there wasn't easy, and Janine's mother made sure she understood that love wouldn't keep the lights on or food on the table. Those lessons stayed with Janine, driving her to dream big and push harder than anyone else. When Janine met Tommy at a builder's expo, she didn't just see a kind, hard-working man. She saw stability, a future, an escape from the struggles of her past. Tommy was smitten from the start, charmed by her laugh and the way she always seemed to know just what to say. But for Janine, their budding relationship was more like a puzzle, each piece carefully placed to fit her plan. As the months went on, Janine crafted the image of the perfect partner. She listened, she cared, she supported Tommy in every way. But beneath the surface, her plans were always ticking away. And then, everything changed when Luke walked into her life. Luke Sanders was Tommy's opposite in every way. Where Tommy was solid and dependable, Luke was unpredictable and magnetic, with a grin that promised trouble. He wasn't a planner. He lived in the moment, and that energy drew Janine in like a moth to a flame. The first time their paths crossed at a bar in town, it was electric. What should have been a passing flirtation turned into a secret neither of them could let go of. Luke knew it was wrong, but the pull was too strong. For Janine, the affair was risky, but also intoxicating. She thrived on the control she had, using her charm to keep Luke close while ensuring he wouldn't dare breathe a word to Tommy. By the time the wedding day arrived, Janine's double life had become a balancing act that teetered on the edge. She smiled for the cameras and clung to Tommy's arm, but her mind raced with what-ifs. She had her future in sight, but secrets have a way of surfacing, and hers were beginning to crack through the surface. Luke watched her walk down the aisle, his jaw tight, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Every vow she said to Tommy felt like a dagger in his chest. Yet, he stayed silent, torn between loyalty to his brother and the undeniable connection he had with Janine. As Janine and Tommy kissed to seal their vows, the crowd erupted in cheers, but beneath the applause, one thing was certain. This wasn't a happily ever after. It was the start of a storm, a collision course that none of them could escape. The wedding might have gone off without a hitch, but what came next was anything but a fairy tale. Beneath the surface of Janine and Tommy's picture-perfect union, a ticking time bomb was waiting to go off. And at the center of it all was Luke Sanders. Luke wasn't just Tommy's younger brother. He was the wild card. The one who could make you laugh until your sides hurt, but who always carried an undercurrent of chaos. While Tommy was the reliable rock, Luke had a way of lighting up a room and turning heads. That energy made him magnetic, but it also meant trouble was never far behind. Luke wasn't looking for complications, especially not from his brother's fiancée. But there was something about Janine that drew him in. Maybe it was her sharp wit, the way she seemed to see straight through him, or the fact that she was just out of reach. Whatever it was, it started small. An inside joke here, a lingering glance there, but before long, they were sneaking around. At first, Luke tried to tell himself it didn't mean anything. A kiss here, a whispered conversation there. What harm could it do? But every time they met, the connection deepened. Luke began to convince himself it was something real, something that could last. And Janine? She was more than happy to let him believe that. For Janine, the affair wasn't just about passion. It was about power. She had Tommy's love and devotion, but now she had Luke's loyalty too. She used every tool she had to keep Luke close. Her charm, her vulnerability, even her own guilt. "You don't want to hurt Tommy, do you?" she'd ask softly, her voice breaking just enough to twist the knife. Luke would cave every time, torn between his feelings for her and his loyalty to his brother. But Luke wasn't the only one falling deeper into Janine's web. Tommy, blissfully unaware of what was happening behind his back, was more in love with her every day. When Janine found out she was pregnant, she didn't panic. Instead, she leaned into the lie, painting a picture of a perfect future. "We're going to be parents," she told Tommy, guiding his hand to her belly. Tommy's face lit up like it was Christmas morning. He wrapped her in a tight hug, whispering about how this was the happiest day of his life. For Tommy, this was the final piece of the puzzle. He dreamed of having a family, and now it was all coming together. But Luke wasn't so easily convinced. The timeline didn't add up, and the doubt gnawed at him until he couldn't keep it in any longer. "Is it mine?" he asked her one night, his voice low and thick with desperation. Janine didn't flinch. "No," she said, her tone steady. "This is Tommy's baby. It has to be." Luke wanted to believe her, but the doubt stayed. He started pulling away, avoiding her calls and growing distant when they met. Janine couldn't let that happen. She needed him close, just in case. "You're the only one who really knows me," she whispered one night, her voice barely audible. "Please, don't leave me alone in this." It was a lie, but it worked. Luke stayed, tethered by guilt and the hope that maybe Janine was telling the truth. By the time the wedding rolled around, the tension was unbearable. Tommy beamed with pride as he exchanged vows with the woman he believed was his soulmate. Janine smiled back, playing the part of the perfect bride with ease. But Luke? He looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Every moment of the ceremony was torture for him. The way Tommy looked at Janine, the cheers of the guests, the kiss that sealed their vows, it all felt like a cruel joke. Luke clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms, and forced a smile for the cameras, praying no one would notice the storm raging inside him. At the reception, the tension only grew. Tommy raised his glass for a toast, calling Janine the love of my life and the woman who makes me whole. The crowd cheered and clinked their glasses, but Luke barely looked up from his drink. Every word felt like another dagger, twisting in his gut. Janine worked the room like a seasoned politician, laughing and chatting with guests, her smile never faltering. But she could feel the weight of Luke's eyes on her, burning into the back of her neck. She avoided him as much as she could, knowing one wrong word could send everything crashing down. As the night wore on, Luke's guilt became harder to hide. A few sharp-eyed guests started whispering, noticing how quiet he was, how his gaze lingered just a second too long on the bride. The whispers grew louder as the evening went on, but no one dared to say anything out loud. Janine felt the pressure mounting. Every laugh, every carefully rehearsed moment of affection with Tommy, every stolen glance at Luke. It was like walking a tightrope. She told herself she could keep everything under control, but deep down, she knew the truth. Secrets like these don't stay buried forever. Luke, meanwhile, was coming apart at the seams. He watched Tommy dance with Janine, her laugh ringing out like a bell, and felt the walls closing in. He couldn't stand the sight of them together, couldn't handle the weight of what he'd done. By the end of the night, the air in the room felt suffocating. Luke left early, slipping out the back before anyone could stop him. Janine noticed but said nothing, turning her focus back to Tommy and the guests. But the damage was already done. The stage was set, the players in place. It wasn't a matter of if the truth would come out. It was a matter of when. And when it did, none of them would escape the fallout. Tommy and Janine walked hand in hand, beaming as the guests erupted in applause. The newlyweds looked every bit the perfect couple, completely in sync, completely in love. But behind the smiles and the joyful cheers, a much darker reality simmered. Luke Sanders, standing stiffly off to the side, felt like he could barely breathe. The sound of the crowd clapping and cheering as Tommy kissed his new bride was almost unbearable. Every moment seemed to drag on for eternity as Luke stood there, forcing himself to watch the brother he'd betrayed. The way Tommy looked at Janine, full of adoration and trust, was a knife to the gut. As the couple walked down the aisle together, Luke felt rooted to the spot. The happiness on their faces, their entire future together, was built on a lie, and he was part of it. Every step they took was like another weight pressing down on his chest, suffocating him. Tommy was oblivious. His joy was palpable, his grin wide and genuine as he moved through the crowd at the reception. He greeted guests with heartfelt thanks, shook hands, and shared hugs, his excitement infectious. To him, it was the happiest day of his life. Luke, on the other hand, felt like a ghost. He moved through the reception like a shadow, sticking to the edges of the room and avoiding eye contact. When he couldn't dodge a conversation, he plastered on a tight smile and offered the fewest words possible before slipping away. Janine, meanwhile, was the picture of poise. She floated through the reception, laughing and chatting with ease. She made sure to thank every guest personally, flashing her dazzling smile at all the right moments. But it wasn't just for appearances. Every move she made was calculated, keeping an eye on Luke the entire time. She could see it in his face, the guilt, the anguish, the weight of their secret. His shoulders were tense, his jaw tight, and every now and then, his gaze would linger on her just a second too long. She knew he was unraveling, and that terrified her. When it was time for the family photos, the tension was unbearable. Luke stood stiffly next to Tommy, his hands clenched at his sides. Tommy threw an arm around his shoulder, grinning for the camera. "I couldn't have done this without my little brother," Tommy said with a laugh. "Luke's always been my right-hand man." Luke forced a laugh, but it came out hollow. The photographer snapped the picture, capturing the three of them, Tommy, Janine, and Luke, locked together in a moment that felt like a cruel joke. As the night went on, Luke grew more distant. He nursed his drink in a quiet corner, avoiding the dance floor and the steady stream of guests. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses felt like static in his ears. At one point, Tommy caught up with him. "Hey, you've been pretty quiet tonight," he said, nudging Luke's shoulder. "You all right?" Luke forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired, I guess." Tommy nodded, his concern evident. "It's been a big day, but seriously, I'm glad you're here, man. It means the world to me." Luke's throat tightened, and he managed a quiet, "Yeah, of course." Janine, still mingling with the guests, kept an eye on them from across the room. She could feel the tension radiating from Luke even at a distance. She knew it was only a matter of time before he cracked, and she couldn't let that happen. When she finally caught up with him, it was outside. Luke had slipped out the back of the reception hall, needing a moment to breathe. The cool night air felt sharp against his skin, but it did little to calm the storm in his chest. "What are you doing out here?" Janine demanded, her voice low but sharp as she approached him. Luke didn't turn to face her. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice strained. "You have to," she shot back, stepping closer. "If you say anything, you'll ruin everything. You'll destroy Tommy." Luke turned to her then, his eyes filled with anger and pain. "And what about me?" he asked, his voice rising. "What about our child? You're just going to let him think it's his? Let him raise my kid while I stand on the sidelines, pretending I'm okay with it?" Janine's jaw tightened. "This isn't about you," she said coldly. "It's about what's best for everyone. Tommy can give this baby a real family, stability. You can't." Luke flinched at her words, but he didn't back down. "You think this is sustainable? Secrets like this don't stay buried, Janine. It's going to come out. And when it does, it'll destroy him even more. Janine's expression faltered for just a moment before she regained her composure. Not if you keep it together. We've come this far, Luke. Don't ruin everything now. The sound of the reception door creaking open made them both freeze. Tommy stepped outside, his brow furrowed as he looked between them. What's going on out here? He asked, his tone curious but concerned. Janine recovered quickly, stepping forward with a smile. Luke just needed some fresh air, she said smoothly. We were just talking about the day. Tommy nodded, his expression softening. It's been a lot, huh? He clapped Luke on the shoulder, his smile warm. Thanks for being here, man. It wouldn't have been the same without you. Luke's mouth felt dry, and all he could manage was a weak nod. Tommy turned to Janine. Ready to head back in? Of course, she said, slipping her arm through his. As they walked away, Tommy glanced over his shoulder. You coming, Luke? In a minute, Luke replied, his voice barely above a whisper. When they disappeared back inside, Luke leaned against the wall, his hands trembling. Every instinct told him to come clean, to rip the bandage off and end the charade. But as much as he hated what they were doing, he couldn't bring himself to destroy his brother's happiness. Janine, walking beside Tommy, forced a smile as they returned to the reception. But inside, she knew the cracks were widening. It was only a matter of time before the truth came crashing down around them all. Luke stayed outside long after Tommy and Janine had gone back inside. The cool night air helped, but only a little. His chest still felt tight, his thoughts a whirlwind of anger, guilt, and regret. He pressed his back against the wall, staring up at the stars, wishing for some kind of clarity. How had he let it get this far? He thought back to the early days when it was just a harmless flirtation, a little excitement on the side. But now? Now he was standing outside his brother's wedding reception, torn between his loyalty to Tommy and his connection to Janine, and to the child she was carrying. Inside, Janine plastered on her brightest smile as she mingled with the remaining guests. Most of them were too tipsy or too tired to notice the tension in her shoulders or the way her eyes darted toward the doors. She couldn't stop thinking about Luke. He was slipping further out of her control, and that terrified her. As the night wound down and the last of the guests began to trickle out, Tommy remained in high spirits. He stood by the doors, shaking hands and thanking everyone for coming. You all made this day unforgettable, he said with a wide grin. Janine and I are so grateful. Janine stayed by his side, nodding and smiling, but her mind was elsewhere. Every laugh felt forced, every word hollow. All she could think about was the scene outside, about Luke unraveling, about the lies that were quickly becoming impossible to maintain. When the final guest had left, Tommy turned to her with an exhausted but happy sigh. Well, Mrs. Sanders, we survived the day, he said, pulling her into a warm embrace. Janine laughed lightly, leaning into him. We sure did, she replied. Her voice sounded natural, even to her own ears, but the tension in her body betrayed her. Tommy pulled back, studying her face. You okay? You've seemed a little off tonight. Her heart skipped a beat, but she recovered quickly. Just tired, she said with a soft smile. It's been a long day. Tommy nodded, his concern easing. Makes sense. Let's get you to bed. Upstairs in the bridal suite, Janine sat at the edge of the bed, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her makeup was still flawless, her hair perfectly styled. To anyone else, she looked like a woman who had just had the perfect wedding day. But she didn't feel that way. Not even close. She heard the knock on the door before she saw him. Her stomach sank, and she knew instantly who it was. Opening the door, she found Luke standing there, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot. He looked like a man on the verge of breaking. What are you doing here? She hissed, glancing down the hall to make sure Tommy wasn't around. We need to talk, Luke said, stepping into the room before she could stop him. Are you out of your mind? Janine snapped, shutting the door behind him. Tommy's just down the hall. I don't care, Luke said, his voice low but filled with fury. I can't keep living like this. We need to figure this out, Janine. Now. Her heart pounded as she tried to keep her voice steady. There's nothing to figure out, Luke. We've made our choices. Now we have to live with them. Luke shook his head, his hands balling into fists. That's easy for you to say. You're living the life you wanted, with Tommy, the house, the baby. And me? I'm just supposed to sit back and watch, pretending none of this happened? This isn't about you, Janine snapped, her voice sharp. It's about what's best for everyone. Tommy doesn't deserve to have his life blown apart. He doesn't deserve to lose the family he's always wanted. And I'm supposed to lose mine? Luke shot back, his voice cracking. I'm supposed to lose my child? Janine flinched, but quickly recovered. It's not your child, she said, her tone cold and final. The words hung in the air like a gunshot. Luke's jaw tightened, his chest heaving. You don't even believe that, he said quietly. Before Janine could respond, there was a knock at the door. Her blood ran cold. Janine? Tommy's voice called from the other side. You okay in there? Her eyes widened, and she turned to Luke, panic flashing across her face. Don't make a sound, she whispered. Luke stepped back, his face hard, as Janine opened the door a crack. Hey, she said, her voice light but strained. I'm fine, just cleaning up a bit before bed. Tommy tilted his head, glancing past her into the room. You sure? You sound tense. I'm just tired, she said quickly. It's been a long day. Tommy hesitated, then nodded. All right, don't stay up too late. As he walked away, Janine shut the door and turned back to Luke. Her calm facade shattered, replaced by raw anger. You need to leave, she hissed. Luke's face was unreadable, but his voice was steady. This isn't over, Janine. No, she said coldly. It's not. But if you don't pull yourself together, you'll ruin everything for all of us. Luke didn't reply. He turned and walked out, leaving Janine standing in the middle of the room, her hands trembling. Down the hall, Tommy lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Something fell off. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it was there. He shook his head, brushing the thought away. Tomorrow was the start of their new life, and he didn't want to ruin it by overthinking. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Tommy's face was a mix of confusion and concern as he looked at Luke. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice calm but laced with unease. Luke hesitated, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He glanced at Janine, who stood frozen near the doorway, her expression a mix of fear and anger. She was silently begging him to stop, but Luke couldn't hold it in any longer. I've been lying to you, Luke said, his voice strained. We both have. Tommy's brow furrowed further as his gaze flicked between Luke and Janine. What are you talking about? He repeated, his voice quieter now. Janine stepped forward, her voice sharp. Luke, stop. You're not thinking clearly. Luke ignored her, his eyes locked on Tommy. I need to tell you the truth. About me. About Janine. About the baby. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Tommy's face went pale, and for a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, his expression hardened. What about the baby? He asked, his tone low and dangerous. Janine's voice trembled as she stepped between them. Tommy, this isn't the time. Move, Tommy said, his voice cutting through her protests. Janine froze, her breath catching as Tommy's intense gaze turned back to Luke. What? About? The baby? Luke swallowed hard. His chest felt tight, his heart hammering in his ears. He knew there was no going back after this. It's mine, he said finally, the words coming out like a confession. The baby is mine. For a moment, the room was deathly silent. Then, Tommy let out a shaky laugh, though there was no humor in it. You're joking, he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. This is some kind of sick joke, right? Janine stepped forward, reaching for Tommy's arm. It's not what you think. Tommy jerked away from her touch, his eyes blazing with fury. Don't, he snapped, his voice shaking. Don't you dare try to explain this away. Luke took a step forward, his hands raised as if to calm his brother. Tommy, I didn't mean for this to happen. Tommy turned on him, his fist connecting with Luke's jaw before anyone could react. Luke stumbled back, crashing into the wall. You didn't mean for this to happen? Tommy shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. You didn't mean to sleep with my wife? You didn't mean to father her child? Luke straightened, wiping the blood from his lip. I'm sorry, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Sorry? Tommy repeated, his laugh bitter and hollow. You think that fixes this? You think that changes anything? Janine tried again, her voice pleading. Tommy, please, let's just talk. Talk? Tommy roared, turning his anger on her now. What's there to talk about, Janine? You betrayed me. You both did. The room felt like it was collapsing in on itself, the tension unbearable. Janine took a step back, her hands trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't know what to do. Tommy's face twisted with pain. You didn't know what to do? How about not sleeping with my brother? How about not lying to me for months? Luke stepped forward again, his voice steady despite the chaos. Tommy, it wasn't just her. It was me too. I take responsibility for what I've done. Tommy turned to him, his eyes filled with betrayal. Don't you dare try to make this noble, he spat. You're not some hero, Luke. You're a coward. Both of you are. The words cut deep, but neither Luke nor Janine had a response. The truth was out now, and there was no undoing it. Tommy took a step back, shaking his head as if trying to process everything. I trusted you, he said, his voice quieter now. Both of you. I loved you. And this is what I get in return. Janine's tears spilled over as she tried to approach him. Tommy, please. Don't, he said sharply, holding up a hand to stop her. Just don't. The silence that followed was deafening. Tommy's chest heaved as he fought to keep his emotions in check, while Luke and Janine stood frozen, too afraid to move or speak. Finally, Tommy turned toward the door. I need to get out of here, he said, his voice barely audible. Tommy, wait, Luke said, stepping forward. But Tommy was already gone, slamming the door behind him as he stormed out into the night. The room was left in shambles, the weight of the truth hanging heavy in the air. Janine sank to the floor, her face buried in her hands as sobs racked her body. Luke leaned against the wall, his head tilted back, his eyes shut tightly. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. Outside, Tommy stood in the cold night air, staring up at the sky. His mind was a blur, his chest tight with anger and heartbreak. He thought back to every moment he had shared with Janine, every laugh, every kiss, every promise. He thought about Luke, the brother he had always trusted, the one person he thought would never betray him. The pain was overwhelming, suffocating. Tommy clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He had no idea what to do, no idea how to move forward. All he knew was that the life he thought he had was gone, and there was no way to get it back. It all happened in a single, volatile moment, a desperate, impulsive act fueled by emotions running out of control. Tommy lunged at Luke, his rage boiling over, his mind clouded by the weight of betrayal. The room descended into chaos, their struggle filling the air with the sound of shouts, heavy breaths, and the crashing of furniture. And then, in a split second, the unthinkable occurred. A misstep, an accident, and Luke fell hard, his body hitting the ground with a sickening thud. The room went still as the reality of what had just happened settled over them like a suffocating fog. Janine screamed, the piercing sound cutting through the silence as she rushed to Luke's side. Her hands trembled as she cradled his lifeless body, her sobs echoing in the stillness of the cabin. But it was too late. The damage was done, irreversible. Tommy stood frozen, his hands shaking as he stared at the scene before him. His anger evaporated in an instant, replaced by a deep, soul-crushing horror. He didn't mean for this to happen. He couldn't comprehend the reality of what he had done. The room, which had just hours before been filled with hope and celebration, was now steeped in tragedy. The weight of the moment pressed down on them, suffocating and unrelenting. What had been a day marking the beginning of a new chapter had turned into a night of devastating consequences, a moment that would haunt them all for the rest of their lives. Janine's sobs continued, the sound raw and unfiltered, a testament to the unimaginable loss she was experiencing. Luke, who had once stood as a symbol of Tommy's closest bond, now lay lifeless in her arms, a victim of choices, secrets, and emotions that spiraled out of control. Tommy's mind raced, but no coherent thoughts came. He was numb, his heart shattered beyond repair as he replayed the moment again and again in his mind. There was no undoing it, no fixing it. The bond between them, the love and trust they had all shared, was irreparably destroyed. The cabin felt like a tomb, the air heavy with shattered dreams and irretrievable losses. What should have been the start of something beautiful had instead become the end of everything they had once held dear. Each of them, Tommy, Janine, and Luke, had paid the ultimate price for their lies and betrayals. The tragedy that unfolded that night left scars that would never heal. Lies and betrayal tore apart what had once been a foundation of love and trust, leaving behind a void that could never be filled. Their choices, made in secrecy, spiraled into consequences none of them could have foreseen, shattering lives in ways that could never be undone. It forces us to confront unsettling questions. How far can betrayal go before it consumes everything? Can trust, once broken, ever truly be repaired? This story is a chilling reminder of how fragile relationships can be and how the choices we make, no matter how well-intentioned, can have devastating consequences. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If it moved you or gave you something to think about, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel for more everyday videos like this.